Don't sign it. The words cracked through the polished silence of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom with a force no one expected from the young black waitress standing beside a silver coffee cart. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting hands. Conversations collapsed into stunned silence. Even the soft piano drifting through the room seemed to disappear beneath the weight of four impossible words. Every executive turned. Every attorney froze. Every camera from the financial press instinctively shifted toward the interruption. At the center of the room stood Ethan Brooks, the 38-year-old billionaire CEO, whose signature was only inches away from closing the largest acquisition in his company's history. The contract resting before him represented a $4.8 billion merger that Wall Street analysts had already called the deal of the decade. Investors smiled confidently. Board members exchanged relieved glances. Reporters prepared headlines celebrating another flawless victory for the man who had built Brooks Dynamics from a struggling software startup into one of America's fastest-growing technology empires. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the final page of the agreement and looked toward the unexpected voice. Standing beneath the glow of towering chandeliers was a waitress no one had noticed until that exact second. Her name tag read Naomi Carter. She wore a perfectly pressed black uniform, simple shoes, neatly tied curls, and an expression that carried neither panic nor arrogance. She simply looked certain. Around her, nervous managers immediately hurried forward, whispering apologies to the guests while security exchanged uneasy glances. Interrupting a billion-dollar signing ceremony was unthinkable. Interrupting Ethan Brooks himself was almost unheard of. Yet Naomi didn't move. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't apologize. She simply repeated herself, quieter this time, but somehow even more impossible to ignore. He's not telling the truth. The words settled over the room like an unexpected storm cloud. Ethan's hand remained suspended above the contract, the expensive fountain pen still uncapped between his fingers. Across the polished conference table sat Victor Langford, the celebrated investment executive whose polished smile had convinced everyone present that this partnership would reshape the future of artificial intelligence. Victor laughed softly, shaking his head as though the interruption were nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. "I'm sure she's confused," he said with effortless charm. Several guests chuckled politely. Others nodded, eager for the awkward moment to disappear so the ceremony could continue. But Ethan didn't laugh. Years of leading billion-dollar negotiations had taught him that confidence often arrived quietly, while deception usually rushed to explain itself. He studied Naomi for another long second. There was no fear in her face, no desperate search for attention, no dramatic performance, only quiet conviction. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered beneath the golden light of early evening, reflecting across the river like sheets of liquid glass. Inside, the room had become impossibly still. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, someone slowly lowered a champagne flute onto a linen-covered table. Another executive discreetly closed his laptop. The atmosphere no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like the instant before history decided which direction it would turn. Ethan Brooks had spent his entire career believing numbers never lied. In less than a minute, a waitress no one had bothered to notice would force him to question whether the people behind those numbers had been telling the truth all along. The silence stretched just long enough for discomfort to settle over every corner of the ballroom. Ethan Brooks slowly lowered the pen onto the polished walnut table without signing the agreement. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the first to interrupt the fragile balance that had suddenly replaced absolute confidence. Victor Langford maintained the practiced smile that had earned him a reputation as one of the country's most respected investment negotiators. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and gave a reassuring laugh that sounded almost rehearsed. "Mr. Brooks," he said calmly, "I believe your staff member simply misunderstood something she overheard. Big days can make people nervous." Several board members nodded with visible relief, eager to restore the momentum of a deal they had spent 11 months negotiating. The company's chief legal officer quietly reached toward the contract again, assuming the interruption had ended. Ethan did not move. Instead, his attention remained fixed on Naomi Carter. She stood perfectly still beside the untouched coffee service, surrounded by anxious hotel managers who looked as though they wished the marble floor would simply open beneath them. One of them leaned closer and whispered that she should return to the kitchen immediately. Naomi acknowledged him with a polite glance, but did not leave. She understood exactly what standing there might cost her. The job paid her hourly wages that covered rent, groceries, and community college tuition. Losing it would not simply mean finding another restaurant. It could delay every dream she had carefully built over the last 4 years. Yet she also knew something far more expensive than a paycheck was sitting on the conference table. Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured and surprisingly calm. "What exactly do you believe is not true?" The question landed like another unexpected shockwave. Victor's smile faded for the first time. Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. Waitresses were not asked for opinions during billion-dollar negotiations. They certainly were not invited to explain themselves before an entire board of directors. Naomi took one careful breath. She had spent her life learning that speaking without certainty only made people dismiss you faster. Her grandmother had repeated the same lesson every Sunday afternoon while balancing old household budgets at a tiny kitchen table in Cleveland. "Facts speak louder than confidence," she always said. Naomi never forgot those words. She looked directly at Ethan. "About 30 minutes ago, I was serving coffee in the Magnolia Lounge outside this ballroom. Mr. Langford stepped away to take a private phone call. He believed he was alone." Victor folded his arms. "This is becoming ridiculous." Naomi continued without raising her voice. "He said the acquisition would be finalized before anyone discovered the licensing dispute. He said your legal team would never find the missing disclosure until after the merger closed." The room became still again. Ethan's general counsel slowly looked toward Victor before opening a thick binder containing the due diligence reports. Fingers moved quickly through color-coded tabs. Another attorney began searching digital files on a tablet. Victor let out a confident chuckle, but this time it carried the faintest crack beneath its polished surface. "You are relying on the memory of a waitress?" he asked. Ethan answered before anyone else could. "No." His eyes remained on Naomi. "I am relying on the possibility that someone with nothing to gain chose to speak anyway." Across the table, the attorneys continued reviewing documents with growing urgency. For the first time that afternoon, the celebration had completely disappeared. The deal was no longer moving toward a signature. It was moving toward the truth, wherever that truth might lead. The lead attorney stopped turning pages. His fingers rested on a single paragraph buried deep inside the due diligence binder, and the confidence that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier quietly began to dissolve. Ethan Brooks noticed the subtle change immediately. Years of negotiating with investors had taught him that experienced lawyers rarely showed emotion unless they had found something worth fearing. Around the table, conversations faded into uneasy whispers as more members of the legal team opened electronic copies of the agreement and compared them against the printed documents. Victor Langford leaned back in his chair with practiced patience, but the effortless smile that had carried him through countless negotiations was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Ethan watched him carefully. Confidence was still there, yet something beneath it looked less like certainty and more like calculation. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing, her hands folded calmly in front of her apron. She had no legal training hanging on her office wall, no executive title beside her name, and no expensive suit that announced authority before she spoke. What she possessed instead was something far less visible and often far more valuable. She paid attention when everyone else assumed nothing important could happen around a person carrying a coffee tray. During every shift, she quietly observed conversations, body language, and habits. Years of balancing evening classes in accounting with long restaurant hours had taught her that details almost always told a story before people realized they were speaking. Earlier that afternoon, while serving espresso in the Magnolia Lounge, she had noticed Victor step away from his colleagues with unusual urgency. His polished voice had remained calm, but one sentence had frozen her attention. He had quietly assured someone on the phone that the intellectual property issue would become Brooks Dynamics' responsibility immediately after closing, because the disclosure language had been carefully buried inside supplemental documents that no one would question before the ceremony. Naomi had not understood every legal phrase, but she remembered every word. She also remembered something else. Victor had ended the call by saying, "Once the signature is on paper, They will own the problem instead of us. Those words refused to leave her mind. She spent the next 20 minutes debating whether she had misunderstood what she heard. She reminded herself that billion-dollar negotiations involved complex language ordinary people often interpreted incorrectly. She nearly convinced herself to stay silent. Then she noticed Victor personally rearranging several folders moments before the meeting resumed. It was a small action, almost invisible, but unnecessary. Executives rarely handled paperwork after attorneys completed final reviews. Something felt wrong. Her grandmother's old lesson echoed again. If something does not make sense, do not ignore it simply because important people seem comfortable. Across the conference table, one of Ethan's senior attorneys finally cleared his throat. He carefully slid a supplemental licensing appendix toward the center of the table. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "this attachment references an unresolved patent challenge that was not included in our executive summary." Another lawyer immediately looked up from his tablet. "Neither was the pending arbitration listed in the disclosure index we reviewed yesterday." The room became motionless once again. Ethan slowly shifted his attention from the documents back to Victor. Outside, the last rays of sunlight reflected across the Chicago River, painting the glass walls with warm gold. But inside the ballroom, every familiar certainty was beginning to fade. A signature that had seemed inevitable only minutes before now rested beneath the growing shadow of unanswered questions. And the only person who had seen that shadow before anyone else was the waitress everyone had almost asked to leave. The chief legal officer adjusted his glasses and slowly pushed his chair back from the table. No one interrupted him. In a room filled with people who built careers on confidence, hesitation suddenly carried more weight than certainty. He carefully compared the supplemental appendix with the original disclosure checklist prepared during the final stage of negotiations. One page after another revealed small inconsistencies that had seemed insignificant on their own, but now formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Ethan Brooks folded his hands together, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often encouraged the truth to reveal itself faster than anger ever could. Victor Langford leaned forward with an expression that blended patience and mild disappointment. "Every major acquisition contains technical revisions," he explained smoothly. "These are routine legal updates. I would hate to see unnecessary confusion delay an opportunity that benefits both companies." His voice remained polished, reassuring, almost comforting. It was exactly the tone that had convinced investors, regulators, and business journalists for more than 20 years. Yet something had changed. The room no longer accepted his confidence as proof. It had become something that required verification. One attorney quietly raised another document. "This licensing dispute was filed 6 weeks ago," she said. "Why was it not listed in the executive disclosure summary?" Victor answered immediately. "Because our outside counsel believed it would be resolved before closing." Another lawyer responded without emotion. "Then why does this internal memorandum estimate potential damages exceeding $800 million? No one reached for their coffee anymore. The drinks had gone cold while everyone focused on the growing stack of documents now spread across the conference table. Reporters near the back of the ballroom stopped whispering and simply watched. Even the hotel staff paused their work, sensing that the afternoon had transformed from a celebration into something far more consequential. Ethan slowly looked toward Naomi again. She had not moved from her place beside the silver serving cart. Her calm expression had not changed since she first spoke. She was not enjoying the attention. She was waiting to discover whether speaking the truth had actually mattered. Inside her mind, doubt quietly competed with conviction. Perhaps she had misunderstood everything. Perhaps the lawyers would explain the documents and prove Victor completely innocent. Part of her almost hoped they would. Being wrong would be embarrassing, but watching an honest man suffer because she stayed silent would have been far worse. Ethan noticed the uncertainty in her eyes. He recognized it because he had seen it years earlier in young engineers presenting risky ideas inside his company. Honest people questioned themselves before questioning others. That realization lingered in his thoughts. Across the table, Victor finally allowed a trace of frustration to appear. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "are we truly allowing an interrupted lunch service to dictate a $4.8 billion decision?" Ethan answered with remarkable composure. "No, we are allowing evidence to dictate it." The chief legal officer slowly closed the binder and looked directly at Ethan. I recommend we suspend the signing until every supplemental disclosure is independently verified. The words landed with quiet finality. Several board members nodded almost immediately. Others looked stunned, realizing months of negotiations had just come to an unexpected halt. Victor's confident smile disappeared completely for the first time that afternoon. Outside, the evening lights of Chicago began to glow across the skyline, while inside the ballroom one undeniable truth settled over every person present. The value of the deal had not changed. Only the amount of trust left inside the room had. The meeting officially entered recess, but no one left the ballroom. Instead of walking toward the buffet or gathering beside the windows overlooking the Chicago River, executives formed quiet circles around legal teams, speaking in careful whispers that carried more concern than confidence. Every minute that passed without a signature made the unanswered questions heavier. Ethan Brooks stood alone near the end of the conference table, watching attorneys compare disclosure reports with regulatory filings that had just been requested from their research department. For years, he had believed preparation eliminated surprises. Today, one unexpected voice had exposed a possibility his entire organization had overlooked. Across the room, Naomi Carter quietly began collecting untouched coffee cups that no one had bothered to drink. She hoped to disappear back into the rhythm of her job before anyone remembered she was still there. She had never wanted recognition. She certainly had never imagined standing at the center of the most important business meeting the hotel had hosted all year. As she reached for a silver tray, Ethan approached her without security, without assistance, and without the distance that usually surrounded someone of his position. Several guests immediately noticed and stopped talking. Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity rather than authority. "Why did you decide to speak?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I almost did not." Ethan waited. She continued. "I kept telling myself that people much smarter than me had already reviewed everything. I thought I was probably mistaken. But I also knew that if I stayed silent and later discovered I had been right, I would remember that decision for the rest of my life." Ethan nodded slowly. It was not the answer of someone seeking attention. It was the answer of someone carrying responsibility. Before he could respond, one of the senior attorneys hurried toward them holding a tablet. His expression had completely changed. "Mr. Brooks," he said, trying to remain composed, "our outside investigators located additional court filings that were uploaded less than an hour ago. They referenced the same patent dispute mentioned in the supplemental appendix. There is also another issue." Ethan looked up immediately. "Go on." The attorney swallowed carefully. "There appears to be an internal email chain discussing the possibility of delaying disclosure until after the acquisition closes. We cannot yet confirm authenticity, but the timeline matches what Miss Carter described." Ethan turned toward Victor, who remained seated across the ballroom, speaking quietly with two advisors. For the first time that afternoon, Victor looked genuinely unsettled. He noticed the attorney approaching Ethan and immediately stood, straightening his jacket before walking across the room with measured confidence. "Surely we are not treating unverified emails as evidence," he said with a polite smile that no longer reached his eyes. The attorney answered carefully. "We are treating them as sufficient reason to continue investigating." Victor glanced briefly toward Naomi. There was no anger in his expression, only disbelief that someone he had never acknowledged during the entire event had altered everything. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a second before meeting his gaze again. She had spent years feeling invisible inside rooms filled with powerful people. Yet she realized something extraordinary in that moment. Being unnoticed had taught her to notice everything. The ballroom lights reflected across the polished marble floor, while another wave of legal documents arrived from corporate headquarters. Every new page seemed to replace certainty with caution. Ethan looked around the room filled with executives, advisors, reporters, and hotel employees. Wealth, titles, and influence surrounded him from every direction. Yet the clearest judgment that afternoon had come from the one person nobody had expected to matter. Sometimes the greatest advantage was not sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it was quietly watching the entire room from the edge of it. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Brooks Dynamics had an internal compliance team known for handling complex acquisitions, and within 40 minutes they transformed the elegant ballroom into something that felt less like a celebration and more like a command center. Laptops replaced champagne glasses. Conference calls replaced polite conversation. Every newly discovered document was examined by multiple attorneys before anyone dared draw conclusions. Ethan Brooks remained remarkably composed, but everyone who had worked beside him understood what his silence meant. He was thinking several moves ahead. He had not built a multi-billion-dollar company by reacting to pressure. He built it by waiting until every fact stood on its own. Across the room, Victor Langford checked his phone more often than before. Each notification seemed to chip away at the confidence he had displayed all afternoon. His advisors quietly stepped away to answer calls of their own, returning with expressions that grew increasingly restrained. The momentum had changed, and everyone could feel it. One of Brooks Dynamics' senior investigators entered the ballroom carrying a thin black folder. He walked directly to Ethan without speaking until the room naturally became silent again. "We verified the court filings," he said. "The patent dispute is active, not pending resolution. We also confirmed that 2 disclosure summaries provided during negotiations omitted material references that appear in the original legal records." Ethan accepted the folder and carefully reviewed the highlighted pages. Every sentence seemed to answer one question while creating another. He looked toward the legal team. "Can anyone explain how these omissions passed through multiple review stages?" The chief legal officer answered honestly. "Because we relied on the disclosure package submitted by the seller. We verified the documents we received. We did not realize certain supporting records had never been included." That single statement changed the atmosphere again. The issue was no longer whether the missing information existed. The issue had become why it had disappeared before reaching Brooks Dynamics. Victor stepped forward, maintaining as much professionalism as possible. "This has become an unfortunate misunderstanding," he said evenly. "Complex transactions often involve administrative mistakes. I believe everyone would benefit from allowing our legal department to clarify these issues privately." Ethan closed the folder and looked directly at him. "If they are administrative mistakes, then transparency should solve them quickly." Victor offered no immediate reply. Near the back of the ballroom, several reporters quietly lowered their phones after receiving instructions that the signing ceremony had been postponed indefinitely. Hotel employees resumed clearing tables, but even they sensed they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed long after the guests had gone home. Naomi continued organizing serving trays, almost disappearing into the background once again. She never attempted to join the conversation or defend herself. She believed the documents should speak louder than she ever could. As she carried a tray toward the service entrance, Ethan called her name. She turned with quiet surprise. "Do not leave yet," he said respectfully. "There may still be questions only you can answer." She nodded once. It was the first time that afternoon anyone had spoken to her not as an employee, not as an interruption, but as someone whose judgment carried genuine value. Outside, evening settled over Chicago, and the lights of the skyline reflected across the river like countless stars resting on the water. Inside the ballroom, the truth was no longer hiding beneath confidence or polished presentations. It was emerging piece by piece through patience, evidence, and the courage of one ordinary woman who refused to ignore what everyone else had been too busy to see. The final piece of the puzzle arrived just after 7 o'clock that evening. A member of the compliance team hurried into the ballroom carrying a sealed envelope that had been delivered electronically from an independent intellectual property firm hired earlier that afternoon. Every conversation stopped before the man even reached the conference table. Ethan Brooks accepted the report, opened it carefully, and read the first page without speaking. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire room. Then he handed the document to his chief legal officer, who immediately began reviewing the findings alongside the company's outside counsel. Within moments, both attorneys exchanged the same unmistakable look. It was not surprise anymore. It was confirmation. The independent review verified that the disputed patents had been under legal challenge for nearly 2 months, and that internal correspondence from Victor Langford's organization acknowledged the financial risk long before negotiations reached their final stage. More importantly, the report confirmed that critical disclosure documents had been intentionally separated from the executive summary delivered to Brooks Dynamics. The missing information had always existed. It had simply never reached the people making the decision. Ethan slowly closed the folder and looked across the table. "Is there any reasonable explanation for this?" he asked quietly. Victor inhaled before answering. There were different opinions within our legal department regarding material relevance. The chief legal officer calmly replied before Ethan could respond. Material relevance is not optional. Information that could substantially affect the value of an acquisition must be disclosed. That is not a matter of opinion. The words settled over the ballroom with undeniable weight. Several board members lowered their eyes toward the table, while others quietly leaned back in their chairs, realizing how close they had come to approving a transaction based on incomplete information. Ethan remained composed, but inside he could already picture the consequences had the signature been placed on paper. Thousands of employees would have inherited unexpected legal exposure. Shareholders would have faced enormous uncertainty. Years of work could have been overshadowed by a problem that honesty should have prevented. He looked toward Naomi once again. She was still standing near the service entrance, saying nothing, almost hoping not to become part of the discussion any longer. Ethan gestured respectfully. "Miss Carter, would you join us for a moment?" Every eye followed her as she walked across the marble floor with quiet confidence. She did not rush. She did not celebrate. She simply stopped beside the conference table and waited. Ethan asked one final question. "When you heard that phone conversation, what made you believe it was important enough to risk your job?" Naomi answered with the same calm sincerity she had shown from the beginning. Because the man on the phone was not worried about solving a problem. He was only worried about making sure someone else owned it before anyone noticed. The room became silent again. No lawyer corrected her. No executive challenged her. The sentence captured everything the investigation had uncovered. Ethan slowly nodded. "That is exactly what the evidence shows." He turned toward the board of directors. "The signing is canceled effective immediately. Our legal department will continue reviewing every document before any future discussion takes place." No one objected. No vote was requested. The decision felt inevitable. Outside, the lights of Chicago reflected across the dark river, while inside the ballroom a different kind of light had quietly emerged. It did not come from chandeliers or camera flashes. It came from the simple truth that integrity could still change the direction of an empire, even when it arrived wearing a waitress uniform instead of an executive suit. By the following morning, the canceled signing had become the only story anyone in Chicago's business community wanted to discuss. Financial reporters who had arrived expecting photographs of handshakes and celebration instead published headlines about a billion-dollar acquisition halted at the final moment after unexpected disclosure concerns surfaced. Analysts debated what the decision would mean for Brooks Dynamics. Investors waited for an official statement. Inside the company, however, the atmosphere was remarkably different from the panic outsiders imagined. Ethan Brooks gathered his executive leadership team before sunrise and thanked them for choosing caution over speed. "A delayed opportunity can always return," he told them. "A damaged reputation is far more difficult to rebuild." Those words spread quickly through the organization. Employees who had spent years admiring Ethan's business instincts now admired something else. His willingness to stop, listen, and verify even when doing so delayed the biggest transaction of his career. Meanwhile, independent investigators continued examining the documents provided during negotiations. Within days, regulators requested additional records concerning the omitted disclosures, and Victor Langford's company announced that it would conduct its own internal review of the transaction process. No dramatic accusations filled the news. No one rushed to conclusions before the facts were complete. Instead, the business world watched as transparency slowly replaced speculation. Back at the Grand Meridian Hotel, life quietly returned to normal. Guests checked in, conferences came and went, and the ballroom was prepared for weddings, charity dinners, and corporate banquets that knew nothing about what had nearly happened there. Naomi Carter returned to her regular schedule as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. She greeted guests with the same warm smile, carried trays with the same steady hands, and arrived early for every evening shift before heading to community college classes after work. Many of her co-workers knew pieces of the story from television reports, but Naomi never volunteered details. When someone called her brave, she simply smiled and said she had only done what she hoped someone else would do for her one day. Late one afternoon, the hotel manager asked Naomi to step into his office. She quietly wondered whether another difficult conversation was waiting for her. Instead, She found Ethan Brooks sitting beside the conference table with no cameras, no attorneys, and no board members. He stood as soon as she entered the room. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said. "Not because you protected my company. Because you reminded me that leadership begins by listening before deciding." Naomi looked surprised. "I was only trying to prevent a mistake." Ethan smiled gently. "That is exactly what the best leaders do." He placed a small envelope on the table. Naomi immediately shook her head. "If that is money, I cannot accept it." Ethan slid the envelope back toward himself without hesitation. "Then I am glad I asked before opening it." His answer made them both laugh softly, breaking the tension that had surrounded every previous conversation. "It is not a reward," he continued. "It is an invitation." Inside the envelope was information about a fully funded corporate scholarship program sponsored by Brooks Dynamics for students studying accounting, finance, and business ethics. The program included tuition assistance, paid internships, and direct mentorship from senior executives. Ethan had personally written Naomi's name across the top of the acceptance letter. She stared at the page for several quiet seconds before looking back up. For the first time since that unforgettable afternoon, words did not come easily. Sometimes the greatest gift is not recognition for what you already accomplished. Sometimes it is someone believing in what you are still capable of becoming. Several months later, the ballroom at Brooks Dynamics headquarters looked very different from the room where everything had begun. There were no emergency legal reviews, no uneasy whispers, and no contracts waiting beneath uncertain signatures. Instead, rows of college students, young professionals, and newly selected scholarship recipients filled the auditorium, each carrying hopes that looked remarkably similar despite coming from very different backgrounds. Ethan Brooks walked onto the stage without the dramatic introduction that usually accompanied one of the country's most recognized business leaders. He paused for a moment, looking across the audience before beginning his remarks. "People often ask me what the most valuable investment of my career has been," he said. "Some expect me to name a company or a technology. They are always surprised when I tell them it was a conversation that almost never happened." The audience listened quietly as he described the importance of curiosity, accountability, and the courage to question comfortable assumptions. He never mentioned dollar amounts. He never described market valuations. Instead, he spoke about character, explaining that the strongest organizations were built by people willing to protect the truth even when no one expected them to speak. Sitting in the front row was Naomi Carter, no longer wearing a waitress uniform but a simple navy blazer as one of the first recipients of the Brooks Dynamics Leadership and Ethics Scholarship. She had continued working part-time while completing her accounting degree, refusing to let success change the habits that had shaped her. She still arrived early. She still listened more than she spoke. She still believed that respect was something demonstrated through actions rather than titles. When Ethan invited her onto the stage, the audience rose in applause before she had taken her first step. She accepted the recognition with the same quiet grace that had defined her from the beginning. Looking across the room, she smiled gently before speaking into the microphone. "I never believed I changed a company," she said. "I believe honesty found people willing to listen." The applause grew even louder. Among those clapping were executives, interns, professors, hotel employees who had been invited as special guests, and several members of Ethan's board of directors. They all understood that the moment they were celebrating had started with something much smaller than a billion-dollar decision. It had started with one ordinary person refusing to ignore an uneasy feeling because speaking the truth mattered more than remaining comfortable. As the ceremony came to an end, Ethan and Naomi stood near the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, watching the evening sun reflect across the river exactly as it had on the day their paths first crossed. Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "everyone thought I was the one making the biggest decision that afternoon." Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Were you not?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, you were. You decided that doing the right thing was worth the personal risk. Everything that happened afterward only proved your decision was the correct one." Naomi looked back toward the city, where thousands of lights slowly appeared one by one as daylight faded into evening. She realized that true influence rarely announced itself with power or wealth. Sometimes it arrived wearing an apron, carrying a coffee tray, and speaking only when silence would have been easier. Ethan had nearly placed his signature on a contract that could have changed his company forever. Instead, that unforgettable day left a different signature behind, one written not in ink, but in integrity, reminding everyone who heard the story that real leadership begins the moment courage becomes louder than fear.